Now, I want to start off briefly by talking about, as a very small boy, I remember hearing people talk about the very old people, none of whom are here now. They used to always say with pride that, boy, I smacked. I went to Monroe School. And I later learned that they were talking about Abby Monroe, who was a legendary principal who was taught here until 1913, when she died when she returned to Bristol, Rhode Island. And the impression she left on them was phenomenal. And so that was one of my first things I remember hearing about Laing as a boy, was the impact she made on this community. But as you know, many of you here know, my dad was Abe Fordham, who taught at Laing from 1950 to 1974. And as many of you remember, he used to always wear the bow tie to class. And for that reason, I'm wearing this today. This is not the same one. Let me make that clear. But it's an honor of who he was and the impact he had on me as a boy. I remember when I was about 3, he would have his briefcase on the bed and he would meticulously work on the bow tie as he was getting ready to come to Laing to teach. And that made an impression on me at an early age that he was doing something special and important. Now, I often tell people that I was never a student at Laing because the high school was over with by the time I was 6 or 7 years old. But in a way I was. So let me explain what I mean by that. One of my earliest memories of this was when I was probably about 3 or 4 years old or so. He took me up to the school and he propped me up on his desk. And so the cheerleaders were sitting up front, so apparently it was a homecoming game or something. That was that same day. So when he brought me into class and propped me up on the desk, the cheerleaders came over to me and started squeezing me on my fat little jaws, start pulling on my fat little legs, and you couldn't tell me that I wasn't the kindergarten Casanova or the playboy of the playground. And so I remember Dad laughing and having a field day at this. And another thing, a few years after this, by the time I was precocious and reading at an early age and all of that, so around his last years of teaching on Sunday nights, I would want to, like any other kid, watch Ed Sullivan or Walt Disney or something like that, right? But this was not always the case because Dad would invariably want to sleep early. And so he'd say, all right, boy, you know what to do. And I'm like, Dad, I want to look at Ed Sullivan or Walt Disney. He said, later for Walt Disney and Ed Sullivan, you know the drill. He had these multiple choice and true false tests, and he'd put them down and say, okay, now, if it matches this, put a check, multiply by 5. If it doesn't match it, put an X, subtract by 5. Good night. I'm like, Dad, come on. You know the drill. I'm like, look at this, having me as cheap child labor. Okay? But I did not know and had no way of knowing then that he knew that he was preparing me for what I would do many years later at that very same table. Because when Dad was alive, I swore that I would never teach, okay? But he knew. These old folks knew, because I remember even at around 4 years old, they were doing some work at my grandmother's house, and the carpenters were working. And so I just noticed one of the carpenters had a pencil behind his ear, so I picked it up and put it behind my ear, and he just looked at me and he goes, boy, you look like a school teacher. And these older people have a way of putting things in your mind when they know which way you're going. So to fast forward, I did not want to be a teacher when he was alive, but when I went to the University of South Carolina, right after Dad died, my mentor was a man named Dean Willie Harford of the Black Studies Department at University of South Carolina, who led me into teaching. And to show you why I could never not believe in God, I took Dean Harford's class the semester after my dad died. So it was like one role model was going away and another was coming in to finish the job. So much so that the day I taught my first class at the College of Charleston, my mother was alive to see it. So I made it a point to take his briefcase, which to this day I keep his papers, and I put on his original bow tie before it fell apart to go to teach my first class that day. And the fact that my mother lived to see that meant everything in the world. So fast forward to about 2011. I was speaking at some event, and this white lady who was a teacher at the new Laing Middle School heard me speak. And she walked over to me and said, "Hey, you know, I like the way you speak." And I said, "Well, thank you." And so she said, "Would you like to speak at an event that I have in mind for you?" And I said, "Oh, what's that?" She said, "The Laing Commencement." I'm like, "You want me to speak at that?" And she said, "Yeah." And so I smiled, and she called me later and said she had no idea that my dad had taught there for 25 years. So of course I'm going to speak, right? So the day I went into the auditorium to speak at the commencement, I started speaking, and I noticed these elders standing up when I started speaking. Y'all forgive me.
That's all right.
And those were his old students.
Yes, you're all right. That's all right.
And this was their way of showing respect,
Yes.
that I was up there representing him. And words cannot describe how that made me feel. But sometime after that, they were getting ready to close down the Laing School that was there back in the 50s and 60s. And so I went there for this. And Joyce Coakley from up around 6 Mile, she was taking me around the building. And we went through all these places. And then when she took me to Dad's classroom, that's when I lost it. I'll be honest with you, because you see, even after all these years, the desk was in the same location, the periodic table was in the same location at the wall, and they literally had to carry me out of there. I couldn't take it. But that experience helped me realize something. I was never a student at Laing, but Laing is a part of me and who I am.
Yes, yes. Yes.
So I could definitely say to people that I may have never been in a class there other than to visit my dad's class and all of that, but in a sense, it made me what I am today, just as it did with a lot of you in this room today, and I am honored to sit up here and represent that today. Thank you.